The franchise was 6 years into silence when Timothy Zahn published a sequel. No new films in development, no major publishing pushes. Between 1985 and 1991, Star Wars had retreated to syndicated reruns and clearance bin merchandise. The kind of institutional quiet that usually means a property is being managed down rather than forward. Bantam Spectra had acquired the license to publish new Star Wars fiction, and Zahn was their first choice. A Hugo Award winner, a veteran of military science fiction, someone who understood how to construct large-scale space opera with real political stakes. He took the commission seriously enough to write an actual novel, not a branded product. Heir to the Empire published in May 1991. Bantam's first print run was 60,000 copies. It sold out in a week. By June 30th, 1991, the novel was sitting at number 1 on the New York Times fiction bestseller list. It had debuted at number 11 and climbed, overtaking John Grisham's The Firm along the way, staying on that list for 29 weeks. The original trilogy had ended 8 years earlier. The audience, it turned out, had been waiting. They hadn't left the franchise. Nobody had given them anything worth reading. What they found in that book was a sequel, a genuine continuation of the story the films had told. Set 5 years after the Battle of Endor, in a galaxy where the rebellion won the war and is now discovering that governing is harder than fighting. The New Republic is politically fractured and militarily stretched. Han Solo is navigating the strange, peacetime life of a man whose skills are all violent. Leia is pregnant with twins, still the sharpest political mind in the room, doing 3 jobs while carrying 2 children. Luke Skywalker is the last Jedi alive, and he's doing the only thing that means anything, looking for people he can train. That story, across 3 books, sold over 15 million copies. Dark Force Rising followed in 1992. The Last Command arrived in April 1993. By the time the trilogy was complete, Timothy Zahn had built what millions of readers treated as the actual continuation of Star Wars, not supplementary material, the sequels. When Disney paid $4.05 billion for Lucasfilm on October 30th, 2012, they purchased every page of it. When Kathleen Kennedy was later asked, in a Rolling Stone interview, about developing sequel films, she said, "Every one of these movies is a particularly hard nut to crack. There's no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have 800-page novels." That is the charge. Everything that follows is the evidence. The books. To understand what was discarded, you have to know what was actually in those 3 novels, not as a fan exercise, but as a matter of inventory. Heir to the Empire's central threat is Grand Admiral Thrawn. Blue skin, red eyes, angular chiss features, the only non-human to hold Grand Admiral rank in an empire built on human supremacy. He held that rank because he was too strategically brilliant to sideline. Thrawn doesn't win through resources or aggression. He studies the art of his enemies, their paintings, sculptures, cultural objects, and reconstructs their psychology from what they choose to create. In one scene, he examines alien artwork and tells his officers precisely how that species will respond when their defensive lines are breached. He is almost always correct. That is the trilogy's central conceptual architecture, a villain who wins by understanding people, not by having a larger army. His campaign unfolds on 2 levels. Publicly, he's running coordinated military strikes that destabilize the New Republic faster than they can reinforce. Covertly, he's hunting the Katana fleet, 200 Dreadnought-class capital ships, sometimes called the Dark Force, that vanished decades earlier when their crew died from a plague, and their slave circuit autopilots kept the ships running, drifting somewhere in deep space. Finding those 200 warships would give the Imperial remnant enough hardware to credibly threaten the Republic's military structure. Both sides are searching simultaneously. The race sustains all 3 books' tension. Thrawn also has a partner who complicates everything, Jerus Sabaoth, a clone grown from the cells of a long-dead Jedi Master, dangerously unstable, capable of force-linking entire Imperial crews to make them more effective than organic coordination allows. Sabaoth wants Luke Skywalker and Leia's unborn twins in exchange for his help. His motives are never fully trustworthy, which is the point. He isn't a weapon Thrawn controls. He's a weapon Thrawn is temporarily pointing in the right direction. Dark Force Rising, published 1992, escalates the race for the Katana fleet while exposing the New Republic's structural vulnerabilities. A senator named Borsk Phalia, a Bothan who treats military assets as personal political currency, nearly hands Thrawn the fleet's location to score a domestic political victory. The novel's most unsettling argument is that the New Republic's enemies inside it are as dangerous as the ones outside. Luke is captured. Mara Jade, working with the heroes out of necessity rather than allegiance, is forced to decide whether to leave him to his captors. She doesn't. But the decision costs her something. The novel ends without full resolution, the fleet still in play, the working alliance between Luke and Mara deepened by shared danger and still uncomfortable for both of them. The Last Command, April 1993, resolves everything at once. The Empire has been deploying clone soldiers, grown at a secret facility on the planet Wayland, bred quickly and incompletely, mentally unstable, but militarily viable enough to replenish Thrawn's depleted ranks. The heroes have to destroy the facility. Thrawn's fleet is simultaneously pressing an assault on Coruscant. The pace of the final third is relentless, in a way that earns the resolution rather than rushing it. Thrawn's death is the moment the trilogy is remembered for. He isn't killed by the heroes, he's killed by his own bodyguard, Rook, a Nogri warrior who discovers that Thrawn's protection of his species has been sustained manipulation rather than genuine alliance. The betrayal is internal. Thrawn's final words, looking at the battle data, but it was so artistically done. A villain acknowledging he lost to something he genuinely couldn't have predicted. Not a death speech, a character conclusion. Mara Jade's resolution runs alongside it. She kills the Sabaoth clone in the Last Command's final pages, executing the only version of the Emperor's last command she can live with, destroying his last weapon, built from someone else's template. 3 books to get there, 1 sentence to land it. That is what 15 million copies bought. An earned ending, for a villain and an anti-hero whose trajectories were defined from page 1 and delivered on page last. Mara Jade. She deserves specific attention because she is the character Disney destroyed most completely by simply refusing to acknowledge she ever existed. Mara Jade Skywalker. That was her name by the time the EU had developed her fully. Former Emperor's Hand, former Smuggler's Operative, Jedi Master, wife of Luke Skywalker, mother of Ben Skywalker. In 1997 and 1998, Zahn published The Hand of Thrawn duology, a 2-novel follow-up set 10 years after the original Thrawn trilogy. Luke proposes to Mara in Vision of the Future. Their wedding is depicted in Star Wars Union, a comic series published 1999 to 2000. They have a son. His name is Ben Skywalker, named after Obi-Wan Kenobi, because in the EU, Luke Skywalker is the kind of father who names his son after his mentor and means it as gratitude rather than grief. Mara's arc across the EU is the most complete character development in the franchise's licensed fiction. She starts as the Emperor's most capable personal weapon. She ends as a Jedi Master who chose her own identity by refusing the one she was assigned. The full trajectory from Emperor's Hand to Luke's partner isn't a conventional redemption story. She was never evil, she was trained. It's a story about what it means to choose who you are when the person who defined you is gone. It takes 6 novels to complete. It lands because Zahn built the foundation in the first 3 and had the space to pay it off. Mara Jade does not exist in Disney's Star Wars canon. No film, no live-action series, no canonical novel. The Emperor's Hand, one of the richest character origins in the franchise, was left in the Legends section, and the Disney sequel trilogy gave Luke Skywalker 30 years of solitude instead. He stood on a cliff alone. He named no one. The implication of the sequels is that Luke Skywalker never found anyone worth staying for, and that this absence is poignant. The EU's implication was that he found Mara Jade, which is more poignant and more true to the character. The EU's version required a writer to do the work of earning it. The sequel trilogy's version required no work, just an absence, presented as depth. The universe that followed. Heir to the Empire blew open a franchise that had been commercially dormant. After 1991, Star Wars fiction built continuously for 23 years. Comics through Dark Horse, games through LucasArts, novels through Bantam Spectra and then Del Rey, organized, internally consistent, with broad continuity managed under Lucasfilm oversight. By April 2014, the EU contained hundreds of works, covering a timeline that stretched from tens of thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin to 40-plus years after it. The most significant post-Thrawn fiction tackled the specific generational questions the trilogy had raised. The New Jedi Order series, 19 novels published from 1999 to 2003, written by authors including R.A. Salvatore, Greg Keyes, James Luceno, and Matthew Stover, sent an extragalactic invasion force called the Yuuzhan Vong into the galaxy. A species using organic technology the Jedi couldn't sense through the Force, introducing a threat that couldn't be solved by Luke being powerful enough. The seventh novel killed Anakin Solo, Han and Leia's youngest child, in a suicide mission. That death was permanent, consequential, and shaped Jacen Solo's psychology for years. Legacy of the Force, 9 novels from 2006 to 2008, followed Jacen's descent. He became Darth Caedus. He killed people who loved him. His twin sister Jaina trained specifically, across multiple volumes, to become the person who could stop him. Not because the plot required a convenient resolution, but because she chose to carry that weight herself. She stopped him in the final volume. It's the tragedy of a Skywalker-adjacent heir choosing wrong, told with 3 decades of setup. Anakin Solo, Jacen Solo, Jaina Solo, Ben Skywalker. These were characters with years of history behind them. Not archetypes assembled for a film trilogy's needs. People with prior pages. By approximately 20 years after Return of the Jedi, in the EU timeline, Luke's new Jedi Order had roughly 100 Jedi and 20 students in active training on Yavin 4, organized with a formal council, with no age restriction on admission, and no prohibition on relationships or families. Luke himself was the living demonstration of that last rule. Grand Master, husband, father. The April 2014 Legends announcement told the people who had followed all of that since 1991 that none of it counted. The careful language, turning a new page, full access to the rich content, presented under the new Legends banner, communicated something specific to anyone who had been reading. Anakin Solo's death didn't count. Mara Jade's marriage didn't count. Jacen's fall and Jaina's sacrifice didn't count. 23 years of commercially active, Lucasfilm-approved storytelling, reclassified under a label that means pleasant but not real. That is what Legends means. Not a new chapter, a polite tombstone. 2 Lukes. The most efficient way to make the corporate failure feel like a personal loss is to put the 2 versions of Luke Skywalker next to each other, with specific numbers. EU Luke Skywalker, 30 years after Return of the Jedi, Grand Master of the New Jedi Order, husband of Mara Jade, the woman who spent 3 novels trying to kill him, father of Ben Skywalker, named after Obi-Wan Kenobi. He built a Jedi Order with approximately 100 Jedi and 20 students in active training, organized with a formal council, with no age restriction on admission and no prohibition on members having families. He trained Leia's children. When his nephew Jacen Solo descended into the dark side and became Darth Caedus, Luke stayed in the galaxy and helped coordinate the response. When Mara Jade was murdered by Jacen in Legacy of the Force, Luke's grief was documented across multiple novels, and then he kept building, because that's what he does. Sequel trilogy Luke Skywalker, 30 years after Return of the Jedi, missing. The first information the audience receives in The Force Awakens is that Luke tried to rebuild the Jedi Order, trained a group of students, including his nephew Ben Solo, saw darkness in Ben's future one night, stood over his sleeping body with his lightsaber ignited, stopped himself, and ran when Ben woke up and destroyed the temple. CBR cataloged the Jedi Luke trained in Disney's canon. Leia Organa briefly. 4 students named in comic material, Enyo, Hennix, Vo, and Tai, who were present when Ben Solo burned the training temple down. Grogu, and Ben Solo himself. Somewhere between 15 and 30 students total, by various estimates. Virtually all of them presumed dead or fallen, except Grogu, who trained with Luke for 1 season of The Mandalorian and then chose to leave. In The Last Jedi, Luke tells Rey the Jedi should end. He says the Force doesn't belong to them. He spent 3 years on a remote island deciding that failure was the correct permanent state. His final act was to project a Force illusion of himself across the galaxy, hold it long enough to buy the Resistance approximately 12 minutes, and burn out from the effort. He died facing a sunset, alone, having accomplished a delay. Mark Hamill said to Rian Johnson during production, documented in The Hollywood Reporter, "I pretty much fundamentally disagree with every choice you've made for this character." Those are the exact words. He later softened the public position, said he respected Johnson's artistic vision, and that he'd taken the criticism too far in airing it publicly. The disagreement itself remained a matter of record. What Hamill was pushing back against isn't obscure. Luke Skywalker, across 3 films, is defined by refusing to give up on people. He refuses to abandon his father when every tactical and moral assessment says Vader is past saving. He walks into the Emperor's throne room with no plan beyond the belief that the dark side hasn't won yet. His character identity is hope, expressed as refusal to quit. Sequel Luke's defining act is quitting, and then dying, not in battle, not protecting someone, but projecting an illusion that grants a brief escape. The EU didn't need Luke to fail catastrophically in order to tell a story after him. It required him to succeed, struggle against larger forces than himself, fail occasionally at specific things, and keep building again. That is harder to write. It also produces a character readers genuinely mourn when you take him away, not because they're confused about the difference between fictional and real, but because a character built over 30 years of consistent choices becomes something a readership has emotional equity in. The sequel trilogy didn't produce that equity. It spent it. What Disney purchased. On October 30th, 2012, Disney confirmed the Lucasfilm acquisition at $4.05 billion, half cash, half Disney stock. Bob Iger described it on the investor conference call as adding Lucasfilm IP to our existing Disney, Pixar, and Marvel IP. The plan announced simultaneously a new trilogy of Star Wars films, beginning with Episode 7. The excitement was genuine, and the commercial logic was sound. What came with the IP? The films and trademarks, Industrial Light and Magic, Skywalker Sound, George Lucas's own sequel treatment outlines, written before the sale, depicting a more metaphysical direction for the franchise, focused on what Lucas had publicly described as the wills and the biological underpinnings of the Force. Michael Arndt's in-progress Episode 7 draft, which was later set aside when Abrams and Kasdan rewrote around different priorities, and the complete intellectual property rights to the expanded universe, all 23 years of it, every novel, every comic series, every game, the full body of work continuously published and maintained under Lucasfilm oversight since 1991. Lucas's treatments existed. Arndt's draft existed. The EU existed. Disney's own filing acknowledged acquiring rights to the entire Star Wars franchise. 18 months later, Lucasfilm published an announcement on StarWars.com. The announcement and the quote. April 25, 2014. The legendary Star Wars expanded universe turns a new page. The document was measured. The EU would become Star Wars Legends, no longer canon, still in print, with the explicit statement that creators of new Star Wars entertainment have full access to the rich content of the expanded universe. A new story group was forming to centralize creative oversight, the first time in Lucasfilm's history such a body had existed. The stated rationale for the reclassification, the EU was too vast and complex to tie into a new trilogy of movies that will have to be accessible to new viewers. That rationale has a logic. Someone at Lucasfilm looked at 23 years of interlocking fiction and decided starting over was more practical than adapting existing material. That is a real creative constraint. It describes a choice, the choice to prioritize accessibility over continuity, with reasonable honesty. What Kennedy told Rolling Stone afterward does not describe a constraint. It describes an absence. Every one of these movies is a particularly hard nut to crack. There's no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have 800-page novels. The Thrawn trilogy runs more than 1,500 pages across 3 volumes. The New Jedi Order is 19 novels. Legacy of the Force is 9. Dark Horse Comics had published hundreds of issues of Star Wars material continuously for over 2 decades before the 2014 announcement. The April 2014 statement from Lucasfilm's own website stated explicitly that Disney's creators had full access to the rich content of the expanded universe, a sentence that simultaneously acknowledged the content's richness and confirmed Disney's ownership of it. We don't have 800-page novels can't be reconciled with full access to the rich content of the expanded universe. Both statements came from Lucasfilm. One of them is false. The EU existed before April 2014 and continued to exist after it, physically, on shelves, under the Legends banner that Disney's own announcement created. What changed was the canon label, not the word count. The most charitable reading of the Rolling Stone quote is that Kennedy meant they had no material they considered obligatory to adapt, no source text with the binding institutional authority of a Marvel property that fans would demand a faithful screen translation of. In that narrow sense, the decanonization had deliberately made the EU optional. But saying we don't have something you've just labeled Legends and kept in print isn't a description of your creative options. It's a description of a choice presented as a limitation. The library existed. The choice was whether to walk into it. The sequel trilogy. Disney built. The Force Awakens opened December 18, 2015, to $936 million domestic, a record at the time. The opening weekend alone earned $248 million. By every commercial measure, the relaunch worked. What the relaunch produced structurally was A New Hope, a desert planet protagonist with hidden Force ability and mysterious heritage, a spherical superweapon that destroys planets, a mentor character who dies partway through, a climactic run on the weapon. The new faces, Daisy Ridley's Rey, John Boyega's Finn, Oscar Isaac's Poe, were genuinely compelling enough that audiences on first viewing accepted the familiar scaffolding as warm comfort rather than structural repetition. For one movie that held together, The Last Jedi attempted to break from that structure, and the audience fractured. Rian Johnson made formally interesting choices, sustained interiority for Kylo Ren as a character rather than as a threat, a deliberate interrogation of what heroism and legacy actually cost, a Force connection between Rey and Kylo that had real emotional weight. The Luke arc is where the fracture opened. Hamill's documented disagreement wasn't unique. The film's audience score on Rotten Tomatoes diverged significantly from its critical score, a gap wider than normal variation between critics and viewers, reflecting something beyond standard taste disagreement. The rise.